Good afternoon. Welcome to the first spring semester Great Books Talk. We're here the first Wednesday of each month, and we are starting off today with an adventure and an explorer. Okay. I would like to thank you all for coming on behalf of myself, Maureen Fitzpatrick, and Michael Carriger, my partner in crime. We would also love to thank the CoLab, Audiovisual, and Marketing for their assistance in making this series possible and available not only here, but also through the JCCC CoLab website. Okay. Today, our speaker is Stacy Davidson from the History Department. She has been at JCCC for 12 years, and in the History Department, she teaches History 143, which is Ancient Greece, the Near East, and Egypt, as well as History 151, World History 1. In the Continuing Ed Department, for the last 5 years, she's developed the only community college non-credit Egyptology track. So you might definitely want to look for that, okay? She has served on a variety of committees, both for her discipline and for the college. She is part of the Mellon ACLS Community College Faculty Fellow. Sorry, that was a position for 2021. Also that year, she won the Lieberman Teaching Excellence Award, was a college scholar from 20 to 21, and was a founder and team leader for the Egyptology State and Field Project. She co-founded and was the first president for the Missouri chapter of the American Research Center in Egypt, is an ad hoc member of the Committee on ARCE, Diversity and Inclusion, and has been part of the Kansas Bureau of Speakers, presenters for the Humanities Council of Kansas, She holds degrees in history from Illinois State University, as well as an MA in Near Eastern Studies or Egyptology from the University of Michigan. And her areas of research are Egyptology, the reception of Egypt and Little Egypt, Illinois. I guess there's a partnership there, okay? Ancient Egyptian scribal palettes and ancient languages. And in her spare time, she reads voraciously. Yeah, I guess that we see that. And has particular fondness for late Victorian Gothic works, science fiction, which is where I'm assuming we get today's topic. She also loves travel, maps, art, music, photography, again, also in today's book. She chose today's book for its geographic, historical, scientific qualities, and due to the connections that she feels to the open ocean and the thrill of exploring the world. So, our lead explorer, Stacy Davidson.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I will have to take my one piece back from you, though. I'm gonna need my first page of my notes. All right. So we're going to get just right into it today because, as you can see, this is a copy of the book that I brought with me. It's quite sizable. There are a lot more pages than we maybe have thought that they were there. So there's a lot of material to get through. So what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to be looking at a lot of historical information and also something called reception studies. So that might be kind of a new term to some of you. So reception studies, in a basic definition, refers to how a society or culture adopts, adapts, reinterprets, uses, misuses, or exploits elements from another, one often removed from time and space. In the case of this lecture, we will examine elements of classical and historical reception in Jules Verne's writings, as well as the modern reception of Verne's own works. So the reception of some other material that happened a long time ago, basically. So the book that we'll be looking at, we know in English as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In French, it is 20 000 lieues sous les mers. So we're going to talk a little bit about translations and how that also has an impact on our understanding of a text in just a few minutes here. But I thought we could start with some common misconceptions. So number one, you might feel a little bit duped because when all of this was advertised, it was advertised as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. That's actually not the title. So if we look at the original French, we can see that the word mer is in the plural. And the article that precedes it is also in the plural. So technically, we should all be saying 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. This also helps clear up some of the misunderstanding about what the title actually refers to. So the title refers to distance traveled, not depth. So if you just say under the sea, you're thinking, okay, there's the surface, and then it's just below that. But that's actually not what it stands for at all. You might also think, well, this is a children's book. You know, why do I care about a kid's book? It's actually not a children's book. It's also been described as a work of science fiction. Again, we could argue about that a little bit. There definitely are elements of advanced technology in it, but this particular Verne work, I would say science fiction is not the best classification for it. And probably the only thing you remember from this entire really long book, if you've read any portion of it, is the giant squid episode. So you might think that's the culmination, that's the biggest, most important thing that happens in this book. That's actually not true either. The giant squid episode is a very, very short part of the book and not the main focus at all. And in that giant squid episode, they're actually referred to as devilfish. So I thought we could get that out of the way just kind of at the beginning. And also, because you might be here for the squid, I wanted to put this kind of at the forefront of the presentation. In Verne's time, this kind of idea of a giant sea creature with arms that have suckers on them was more something that happened in mythology. There were stories that had gone around with sailors about this kind of creature that could take down a ship, but the actual biological animal that we now call a colossal squid had not been found yet. The first example or specimen was found in 1925. And as we'll find out, this book was written in the late 1860s. In fact, even today, we only have, I think, 3 or 4 specimens of colossal squid existing that are available for study. And the Museum of New Zealand has, I believe, 3 of them. So if you're interested in learning more about these animals, I would suggest you go to the Museum of New Zealand's website, because each of these little pictures here are clickable, and they will take you to all of the different sections to learn about the animal's biology. So why did I choose this? So here's a lot of personal information. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I chose it because I enjoy these stories of geography and exploration and adventure, and I grew up in a small landlocked town. So, I mean, the sea was quite intriguing to me. I also loved science fiction like Star Wars and Star Trek because, of course, you have people exploring. Geography and science, of course. I would read my grandpa's National Geographics, as you can see, kind of up here. And he came from Michigan, so he and his father also had a connection to the Great Lakes and being out on those and combing the seashores there. And when I read this, I was always kind of intrigued by this complex and mysterious Captain Nemo character. So I'll have a few slides in here that kind of focus on who he is, we think, and what he represented. But this is kind of the rosy view. And oh yes, we also have a picture of the 1954 Walt Disney Productions movie, which many of you probably have seen. Not exactly sticking to the book very closely, but it is entertaining at least. But as everybody here probably has done, you go to a book that you loved in your childhood, you read it again as an adult, and it is a very different book. The same with 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. So armed now with my training in history and textual analysis, and with a greater knowledge of many different disciplines, my rereading changed my impressions of the book. The casual racism and bigotry, often backed by the leading scientific theories of Verne's day, cannot be excused nor bridged away by the time in which it was written. Its complete lack of any female characters is also somewhat appalling, even given the nature of the story as one of a ship and its crew. And we'll talk about the lack of female characters a little later on. So rather than enjoying it for what it is, I now see it in terms of its value in unpacking some of the major societal issues of its day, revealing more about the author and what influenced his works, and for appreciating its impact on future creatives who have taken inspiration from it, but made something new and more inclusive, which we can call the reception of 20,000 Leagues in the modern world. So a little about the author. So Jules Verne was born in 1828. He died in 1905. So he was, conscious and working through the greater part of the 19th century. He was French. He wrote in many different genres, and something that is sort of common of literary people of that day, he dipped into many different fields. So he was trained in law, but he also studied the classics, he studied languages, he studied science and geography, and kept abreast of the new developments in exploration and technology and science, which were all going on during the 19th century. He also worked very closely with his editor, Hetzel, and published over 60 novels in his lifetime, with more works being published after his death. So very prolific writer. And again, you have to remember that writers at that time were often paid by the word, so you definitely wanted to make sure you were a prolific writer so that you could have some income. He also did suffer from some chronic ailments. So he seemed to have some chronic intestinal ailments, which plagued him his entire life. He had episodes of facial palsy, and in his later years, he had diabetes, which apparently is what contributed to his death. I wanted to pick out a couple instances of Verne in the news, because we think of his works as being pretty influential, but he as a person also was someone who was featured in the reports of the day. The first one here is when his nephew, Gaston, attempted to kill him. There are varying reports about this, but apparently his nephew sort of lurked until he exited a building, fired 2 shots, one hit the railing, the other hit Jules Verne in his leg, and then he did survive, of course, from this, as you can see by the date of 1886, but he did have the bullet inside of his leg, and he did kind of limp afterwards. His nephew was found to have some sort of mental collapse of some kind and was basically shuttered away to a sanitarium where he later died. The cause of this incident was not ever securely found out. Okay, so we have a kind of a nicer story as well. So in 1889, Nellie Bly, who was an American journalist, decided that she wanted to do what Verne wrote about in one of his works and go around the world by herself. So on her way around the world, she managed to set up a meeting with Verne at his home. So she met Verne and his wife. And if the reports are to be believed, and again, newspaper reports are not often the truth, but he seemed to think it was a little bit silly that she was going around the world by herself. But she did it, and she did it in 72 days and not 80 days. Much of our ideas about 20,000 Leagues and Verne have to do with the editorial decisions that were made. So the editor Hetzel was very much someone who steered him away from certain topics. He edited some of what he wanted to write to the point where they clashed over 20,000 Leagues. And that seemed to be sort of a major breaking point between the two individuals. The English translations, which you are probably most familiar with, unfortunately were very badly done. So you would think that French to English would not be such a difficult thing to translate, and yet some estimates are that 40% of an English translation is just fabricated and is not what is in the French original, which is why I got the French original, so I could check it out. So is he the father of sci-fi? This is another phrase that is kind of thrown about with Jules Verne. And yes, he does have many works that have advanced technology. He talks about going to space, going to the moon. But I think it's problematic to look at anybody as the father of anything. It's hard to have every piece of available information in the world to know if he is in fact the first one to do these things. And I think you can argue that there are many other works that we would consider to be science fiction works today that precede both his lifetime and his 20,000 Leagues, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Is that not science fiction? We're talking about using anatomy, which is science, scientific methods to create a being made from people parts, essentially, and reanimate it. So that's all described in very, not detailed, but scientific ways, and that predates 20,000 Leagues by over 50 years. So we're left with a bit of a chicken and egg puzzle. Does the existence of a genre encourage works in that genre, or do the works themselves give rise to genres? I'm not going to talk any more about that because we'll be here all day. So the versions that I looked at a version that claimed to be a pretty close translation of the French original into English and also the French itself. So on the surface, what probably drew you to this presentation are tales of adventure and travel and thrills and chills and the wonders of the ocean and human achievement. And yes, those are all present in this book. But we also have, below the surface, very, very disturbing things, such as inequality, oppression, hatred and prejudice, the mass slaughter of humans and animals, the exploitation of humans and the exploitation of the natural world, trauma, and a failed utopia. So before we go any further, I just wanted to make clear that this is a work that is a product of its age. So in the 19th century, there are different ways to talk about people and places that we would not do today. So that this presentation contains some material such as terms, descriptions, or plot points, which may be considered offensive or distasteful to modern readership, particularly in reference to race, national origin, ethnicity, and class. So a brief summary of a very long book where a lot of things happen. The novel tracks the exploits of a unique electric-powered undersea vessel, captained by a man known only as Nemo, through the perspective of outsiders to the Nautilus, the ship, whose lives are saved, but they are imprisoned in the Nautilus and they're not free to leave. So in the course of this book, the Nautilus, which is the undersea ship, faces many challenges and encounters many sights, including underwater volcanoes, icebergs, hurricanes, cannibals, although no one is eaten, other warships, famous lost ships, both wrecked and sunk, and the lost continent of Atlantis. Any of these encounters would also be something of note, not just the giant squid incident. So throughout the work, even from the first 2 pages of the book, Verne references other works that have to do with the sea and traveling the oceans. So he talks about Moby Dick right at the very beginning. He talks about the concept of the Kraken and sea monsters. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge is sort of a major-ish sort of plot point, because the Nautilus and its crew also have an incident with an albatross. So if you're familiar with the poem, you know that the big issue is the killing of the albatross. Well, that also happens in 20,000 Leagues, and right after that albatross incident is when things really start to go wrong for the journey of the Nautilus and its crew. So he's really paying an homage to that earlier work. And he also sprinkles throughout the book different bits of information about historical shipwrecks. So he seems to be quite taken with that idea. So we have just a little bit of a map here of the route of the Nautilus, if you're interested. So this kind of shows the 20,000 leagues that they're going. So they're starting off over here in Asia, kind of going through the middle around the equator. They go through a tunnel, not the Suez Canal, but a tunnel into the Mediterranean. Then from the Mediterranean, they come down to South America, they go down to Antarctica, and then come all the way back up through Europe. So they're really kind of all over. We have our main characters. So those of you familiar with the movie might recognize them as kind of being fixed in your mind as looking a certain way. So I did put that up there just so you could see that. So we have Professor Aronnax, we have Conseil, we have Ned Land, and we have Captain Nemo. So Professor Aronnax is a professor at the Paris Museum of Natural History. He describes himself as a pacifist. He's about 40 years old. Unfortunately, he's also quite a bigoted individual, and he's a proponent of physiognomy, which is the supposed study of people's physical features in order to tell something about their moral character. It is through Professor Aronnax that we experience the events of this book. So part of his bigotry, if you're wondering which kinds, essentially anyone who is not of his social standing in the place where he grew up and who looks like him is fair game for his comments, including even his trusty assistant, Conseil, because he is Flemish, and Ned Land, because he's a Canadian. So we have his very strong viewpoints on different types of peoples throughout the book. We also, in many points, have Captain Nemo coming in to provide counterpoints to Aronnax's comments, however. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about what physiognomy is. So these come from two Greek words, physis, which can be translated origin, nature, or property, and gnomon, which can mean interpreter. So this is something where you think you can look at somebody and judge who they are by what they look like. We have an example here of, this is just from sort of a normal book. You have a genuine husband and you have an unreliable husband. And how you can tell is because of how their faces look, apparently. If you've heard of phrenology, which is touching, measuring parts of the skull, that is a form of physiognomy. Now, we can think, okay, well, this all sounds kind of silly, and we've moved on from this. And we have, in some ways. But it is good to keep note, because these sorts of beliefs have real-world consequences. In the development of fields such as criminology and eugenics. In the worst case scenarios, you have these sorts of beliefs being used to justify things like ethnic cleansing and genocide. So it's very good to understand where some of this is coming from. And this seems very kind of far away maybe to us today, but some of this is sort of creeping into our modern day as well, in terms of some of our technology. So I'm sure you're aware of facial recognition software. This does not work very well for certain individuals. And we have to think about the fact that our technology is created by people. So the people themselves are determining how the technology behaves. So some of these concepts of shape of face, features, these are all kind of coming back in what seems like our modern technology. And in some cases, some of the studies say that the technology failed to even recognize there was a face at all. So that seems like a big problem if you're using these things at border checkpoints or police stations. They need to be accurate to be fair. So it's through Aronnax and his viewpoints about people that we are looking at our book, basically. So his assistant, Conseil, is 30 years old, so he's 10 years younger than Aronnax, but he's referred to as a lad or a boy most of the time. which may be something due to his social status, but it's still a little bit jarring if you're expecting maybe a 12-year-old to be his assistant, and then later on in the book it says he's 30. His name means counsel or advice, but he doesn't really give any in the book. He's very much a yes man. He will do whatever Aronnax wants him to do. He is an expert at knowing the names and classifications of things under the sea, like different kinds of animals and plants, but he can't identify them. So what that means is he has the book knowledge, but he can't practically apply that. If you show him a fish, he doesn't know what that fish is. But if you say what the name of the fish is, he can tell you like 200 things about the fish. And he's very, very happy to be in servitude. So he's in a sort of submissive position to the professor and very content with being there. Then we have Ned Land. So first of all, you might be thinking, why is his name Land? Like, he's a sailor, right? We're talking about ships, the ocean. Why is there a character whose name is Land? So that seems a little strange. He's the same age as Aronnax, which provides a really good foil. So Aronnax believes Ned Land is basically what he is not. So he always talks about him in sort of physical terms. So he talks about him being excessively hungry, he has rude manners, he's violent, he has emotional outbursts. So he's not really acting like a person in society should behave according to Aronnax. And he's also Canadian. He describes him as powerfully built, serious in manner, and not very sociable, quite ill-tempered when crossed. So described in terms of being more of an animal type of person than an intellectual type of person. And then at long last, we get to Captain Nemo. We don't know from 20,000 Leagues what his real name is. We don't know what his nationality is, and we don't know anything about his past. But what we can glean from the material is that he is a polylingual polyglot. So that means he speaks many languages and he knows a little bit about everything. And he's divorced himself and his crew from human society for some reason. Now, why we don't know it is actually because Verne and his editor Hetzel had an argument about this. Originally, Verne wanted Captain Nemo to be Polish, and he wanted him to have a vendetta against the Russian Empire because of some horrible things that the Russians did to his family. Hetzel, being aware of current political climate, said, there's no way that you could do this. I'm not publishing this. We're going to be in some serious trouble, so you need to change this part. And Verne didn't want to change it. So what he did is just cut it. He cut all the backstory and just left him a mystery because he did not want to write what he didn't believe about the character. Yeah. So kind of a fun part, if you haven't noticed already, I really like looking into word origins and what words mean and where they come from. So Nemo is he is completely encased in all of these classical allusions. So classical having something to do with Latin or Greek or Rome or Greece, basically. So his very name actually means no one. This name of no one was used in the Odyssey. So if you're familiar with that, we have a character named Odysseus who goes to the Trojan War for 10 years. He tries to go home, but he's kind of distracted for another 10 years. He can't ever seem to get home, and he has all these adventures that happen with monsters and all sorts of things. So just that very name comes from Book 9 of the Odyssey, which is where he has to outwit the Cyclops, the big monster, the big man-eating monster. And he tricks him. And when the monster, Cyclops, asks him his name, he says, I'm no one. So this is where this is coming from. So we have another allusion to the sea, another allusion to classical travel. But Nemo can also be looked at a few different other ways. So there is a word nemein, which means to distribute what is due or to deal out. We get the word nemesis from this. Nemesis actually originally was a goddess. She was not evil and she was not bad. She distributed what was due. So depending on what you did or who you were, that could be good or it could be bad. In English today, we always think of nemesis as bad, like that's my nemesis. It's always a negative connotation. But in the ancient world, it was not. We also have a Scottish phrase, which is Latin, "No one attacks me with impunity." So this is the motto of the Scottish Royal Stuart dynasty and also Scotland's Order of the Thistle. Verne had claimed Scottish ancestry through his mother and also journeyed there on at least 2 separate occasions and seemed to be quite taken with Scotland. So it could be that there's also a little bit of an interplay with this phrase in Nemo's name as well. And even Nemo, he has a motto. So he's a person with a motto. Now, his motto is not proper Latin, by the way. Verne himself translates mobilis in mobili as moving within the moving element, but what's actually written is perhaps better translated changeable in change. So we're going to look at 2 examples of trying to figure out who Captain Nemo is by his actions. So the first example is coming in part 2. So the book was brought out in 1869 and also 1870 in 2 different parts. So there's part 1 and its chapters, and then part 2 and its chapters. So coming from part 2, chapter 3, which is the pearl diver, we can see the qualities that Nemo is exhibiting are qualities of compassion, altruism, justice, freedom, and his camaraderie with his fellow man. So what's happening in this example is that we have pearl divers. These are people who would free dive for pearls. This is very harsh. You have to be very skilled, first of all, but the effects of doing this over time is very harsh on human bodies because they're not really made to do that. So we're talking about people who have weak vision, they have ulcers in their eyes, sores on their bodies, or they might just die during the dive, all to try to get some pearls so that they can get some resources to live off of. So there's an expedition. The crew comes upon one of these pearl divers. The crew is in underwater gear, by the way, so they've got their helmets and their suits all on, but the pearl diver is he's just there with his human stuff. And a shark comes by and threatens this pearl diver. So Nemo jumps in to try to kill the shark and protect the man, but he needs the help of Ned Land. And this is kind of important because Ned Land, of course, has been clashing with Nemo the whole time he's been on the ship. He's been trying to flee the entire time, but they have to work together to save this man. And then when they do save him, Nemo actually gives him a bag of pearls. He's just carrying around a bag of pearls on his suit and is like, here you go. Which, is more wealth than this man could ever have expected to see in his lifetime in this one particular incident. And, the crew, Ned Land, is like asking, why are you doing this? And Aronnax doesn't understand it really either. And Nemo says, that Indian professor lives in the land of the oppressed, and I am to this day and will be until my last breath a native of that same land. So in both French and English, it's unclear if Nemo is referring to India itself or referring to being a member of the land of the oppressed. And I think the ambiguity was done on purpose. So the phrase here is when Nemo is talking to Aronnax and says, "Sir, what makes you assume this wealth goes to waste when I'm the one amassing it?" Because Aronnax asks him, like, why aren't you giving this to, whatever Aronnax thinks the money should go to? And he says, well, why do you think I'm just keeping this? Do you think I toiled to gather this treasure out of selfishness? Who says I don't put it to good use? Do you think I'm unaware of the suffering beings and the oppressed races living on this earth? Poor people to comfort, victims to avenge. And there's another section where he just gets a trunk of this money, sends it up to the surface, and we assume that it is to help fund a revolutionary outfit in one of the countries in the Mediterranean. So we can see from this example that we have somebody who actually is concerned, even though he's kind of removed himself from society, he is concerned at what happens to people. We also have an instance where Aronnax is looking at portraits that are shown in the captain's stateroom. He's trying to decide, what kind of person is this? Was he a fighter for oppressed peoples, a liberator of enslaved races, Had he figured the recent political or social upheavals of this century? Was he a hero of the dreadful Civil War in America? So all of these questions. So you can see we have a few portraits up here that we might recognize. We have George Washington, we have Abraham Lincoln, we have John Brown. The other four are Europeans who were involved in various skirmishes or wars for independence in their own countries. So it seems like there is sort of an implication that he has something to do with being free from bondage of some sort. And Victor Hugo was also a personal friend of Jules Verne. And Victor Hugo wrote a letter in support of not executing John Brown. Unfortunately, he was actually executed on, basically, the execution was stayed for a moment, but then it actually went through. But we know that there must have been some conversations between Verne and Hugo about this sort of situation. There's actually a lot of information about the American Civil War in this book also. But there are not only good things. So we're going to look at another example where Nemo is shown in a different light. And this is part 2, chapter 12, which is the incident of the sperm whale slaughter, which is basically making a proponent, being in favor of the eradication of an entire species based on what they are. So there are many kinds of whales that Nemo likes. Sperm whales are not one of them. And if you've read Moby Dick, you know that there's a little bit of a connection there as well. So he calls for these animals, and he calls them dreadful, to be exterminated. And that's the word that is used. And this is kind of an interesting section, because in most of the book, Nemo seems to be someone who is, he is at wonder with what the sea is and what the sea can provide. And yes, he and his men still have to eat, but he doesn't seem to be in favor of this overuse of resources or hunting past extinction or things like that, until we kind of get to this episode with the sperm whales, and then he just kind of turns. And the action is described as Homeric. So if you've read the Iliad, you know that what that means is basically you're just reading about everybody dying in great detail for most of the entire work. So it's described with mutilated corpses. A fearsome explosion couldn't have slashed, torn, or shredded these fleshy masses with greater violence. The waves were dyed red over an area of several miles, and the Nautilus was floating in the middle of a sea of blood. So very, very different from this kind of idealistic person who wants to bring an end to struggle and strife among peoples. And actually, what I take to be one of the most poignant parts of this whole book in terms of Nemo's character is not one that probably anybody has ever heard about. So there is a part of the book where they are going to Antarctica. And at this point, no one had been there before. So they had not found the South Pole. This is still an unknown in Verne's world. So Nemo is the first one to go there. Nemo had previously sworn not to re-land anywhere. So he didn't want anything to do with people. He was not going to be on land. But he would go to places where humans had not been or that were uninhabited. So he goes to Antarctica. They have this expedition. And unfortunately, there is basically from the time they step foot on Antarctica, it is just kind of a bloodshed event. So they bring death to this continent that had never known people. Their first action is to kill hundreds of penguins. And these animals, fearing no human, quote, let themselves be stoned to death without making any effort to get away. So it's a pretty short scene. They talk about just needing them for food or whatever. But that's his first activity after arriving on the continent. And so I see this as one of the more tragic parts of the book. So there are two ways to look at this. The more simplistic way The episode reinforces Nemo's beliefs that there's something inherently wrong and unchangeable about humanity, and that the land itself, claiming domination and conquering of land, or merely just its presence in the lives of people, brings out the worst qualities of man. Another way, perhaps more devastating, is that Nemo had his chance. This was his opportunity to prove that humans were not irredeemably violent when he set foot on a land, a territory that had never known human destruction, human-caused suffering, or human-caused pain. Antarctica was a tabula rasa, a blank slate. This was first contact. He could have molded this expedition using his loftiest principles and made this land and its exploration an extension of his life ways on the Nautilus, ways that emphasize science, knowledge, and wonder, proving that his philosophy worked and that humans could be worthy and capable of redemption, that they could be freed of the wrongs of the past and chart a new, more enlightened course into the future. But he failed, miserably and instantly, and humanity carried on the same as it ever did. So I actually find that to be kind of the most tragic part of this whole thing. And there are a lot of options for that, but that one really kind of got to me. So our themes, we can kind of sum up. We have some 3 M's here. We have men, talking about masculinity in the era of exploration. We have machines, talking about this new concept of electricity, things like underwater photography, diving technology, and other feats of engineering, like the building of the Nautilus itself. And we also have modernity, so all the isms and conflict with humanity, but also the conflict between humanity and scientific progress and the natural world. So before we sort of wrap up here, where are all the women? For all of you sitting patiently, unfortunately, there is only one woman who appears in any action in this book, and she is an unnamed corpse who holds a baby. That's it. That's it. At one other point, there is just maybe a mention of the word woman, but that's pretty much it. And during that kind of whale slaughter event, we have a parallel where there is one of the whales that he likes, not a sperm whale, but a different whale, and it is a mother who has a baby whale kind of stuck on its fin. So that's really all we get about women, femininity, mothers, any of that stuff. So yeah. So the modern reception, this is our last section here. So how can these different themes, the men, the modernity, the machines, how can this be updated a little bit for our modern world? So people have already done this and are continuing to do it. So way back in the 1990s, we had a show called Sequest DSV. So this is a deep submergence vehicle. So this was basically sort of like an updated Nautilus. We have a scientific crew, we have crew members coming from different countries, and they're all coming together to explore something about the Earth's oceans. Because of course, we think maybe 90-ish% of the Earth's oceans have never been seen or explored by humans to this day. So this was also considered a sort of underwater Star Trek kind of show. But they did have a scientific consultant, Dr. Bob Ballard, who then was with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, who was a scientific advisor for the series and would appear at the end of each episode of season 1 with pertinent facts about the oceans and plant and animal life that was in the episode. Much like Verne's inclusion of scientific source material, which he added as just dialogue between people in 20,000 Leagues. People don't talk like that, actually, but it's okay. Bob Ballard was actually much more known for finding the Titanic and other famous shipwrecks. So to include him in this, I really appreciated it because I remember watching this show, and the fact that I could remember Dr. Ballard's name, where he worked, and what his had to do with the show 30 years later is a testament to the value of scholars engaging with non-specialists, including children, through popular culture. Just out 2 years ago, we have Rick Riordan, who also does reception. He does things for updating mythology in different series for the modern day. He also loved 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and decided to update that for Daughter of the Deep. So this time we have a female lead character. She is a descendant of Captain Nemo. He's updated the technology as well. And I just finished reading this book actually last night, so pretty cool. And incidentally, Dr. Ballard was an advanced reader for this book, so you can be assured there's some scientific stuff in there. And then, I don't know when, I wish I did, but Disney Plus is working on a series called The Nautilus, where they're having Shazad Latif play Captain Nemo in his younger years, and they're going to show how kind of the crew and the Nautilus all get developed, which should be pretty exciting. So, we have some themes today that are still as relevant as they were when Verne wrote this book. We have the exploration and control of the waters. We have things like climate change, temperature of the water, salinity, sea level rise. We're still concerned with mass extinctions, issues of inequality and exploitation of workers, man's inhumanity to man, and I'll end on a good one, the interconnectedness and interdependence of humanity and all its ecosystems on Earth. So thank you for this, what I'm sure was a pretty whirlwind exploration of a lot of topics in regards to this book, which I enjoyed doing very much. So thank you.
I'm going to ask the first question because
Yeah.
I can. Tell us about your pen.
Oh, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. So this pin, actually, I made specifically for this presentation because I thought Nemo needed a little bling to represent for this whole discussion. So it's a bead embroidery pin that has the N on it, since he had a motto with his N on it. A little gear for the steampunk, and then we have some pearls around the outside because there are a lot of discussions about pearls in the book as well. Just a little bit of shimmer in the blue section for the light rays coming under the water. Yeah.
If you have a question, I'll give you the microphone so that it will be
Yeah, any other questions?
audible for the tape.
Hi, Stacy. I wanted to know, okay, you mentioned electricity,
Uh-huh.
but I wanted to know, when I watched the crazy movie, it looked like it was something more than electricity that was powering the ship. It looked like a nuclear type thing. Can you talk about that?
Yes, what a great question. Okay, so in the book, it is powered somehow unspecified by electricity. So there's discussion of creating batteries, which some of us might be thinking of today, like you'd have to change out batteries, rechargeable sorts of things. And he's getting the source materials to recharge from the ocean itself. So they don't really go to all the specifics of how a battery that's electric, run by stuff you can get out of the water, could run that ship, but that's what's the implication. But what's going on in the movie, you can see the date is 1954 on the movie. We have a lot of concerns at that time about nuclear power, nuclear destruction. So I think that's why they chose to do that as well. It also does provide a nice power source, but that's not too far removed from when nuclear bombs were actually used on people as well. So there's this threat of the advancements of science and what they can be used for that I think they were alluding to in the movie.
Anybody?
I have a question remotely.
Okay,
Stacy,
great.
this is Charlie.
Hi.
Hi. What do you think is the most critical thing might have been lost in translation that might affect people's interpretation of the book?
Yeah, that is
You mentioned a lot of the English might have been just made up or
Yes.
so.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So you should always consider translators to be another author and another editor, because there are so many decisions that have to be made in how you are going to move the concept from one word in one language to another language which may or may not have a similar concept. So I I think the short answer is overall, you just want to pick one of the newer translations which have paid much more attention to what the original French is. But there is one instance that I use to kind of judge if a edition is good or not. So it's talking about kind of nasty areas of Nebraska. So whatever word they use, it's like just blighted or evil areas of Nebraska or something like that. What they're actually trying to translate is the Badlands. So but in French, it's like the bad lands, but they are actually a concept here of badlands. So it's different. It's less of a value judgment and more of a geographic accuracy term. And that kind of goes all the way through the book. So for example, when I mentioned cannibals, so they seem very concerned about these islanders in the South Pacific, and at some points the English translation calls them cannibals, at some points it calls them savages, and some it just calls them the inhabitants of the island. And sometimes where the English editor is using the word cannibal, the word cannibal does not appear in the French. So whether that's just trying to provide some context for us about why they're concerned is one thing, but it's not actually translating what the sentence says. It's giving us extra information and extra information that we can use to have a negative value on the people.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Any other? Yep.
Hi, I had a couple questions. One about your slide, one about the book. The first one was that picture on the slides. Was that you as a kid reading that novel?
Yeah, let's see if I can scroll back like way fast. Yes, there is a picture of me, unfortunately, yes. I slipped that one in there. Yeah, oh, there we go. Yeah, that's me. So that's my grandpa right there. That's my great-grandpa down here. We are not reading 20,000 Leagues in this case. We are actually reading the dictionary because I was one of those kinds of kids. So, but we're having a great deal of fun with it. Yeah, do you have another question?
Yeah, so this novel for me was one of those like bridging books from youth novels to like more young adult mature novels.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a friend who's kind of still a little not sure that they want to bridge to the young adult, and I'm trying to pitch this book to them, but I'm really struggling with finding like a few great sentences to like structure it enough. If you had any ideas on how you would like summarize it to like a younger reader like myself who's trying to bridge into the more adult novels.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So one of the issues is that part of why the translations are so bad is because there was this burgeoning children's book business that was happening, and they were, the editors are thinking, well, they were okay with the violence part, but there wasn't anything else like really questionable, I guess, even with all the racial terms and everything. Nothing too questionable for children of that age. So they kind of like shunted this off into a children's area to kind of help bolster up the amount of books they could say were targeted to children. So I actually don't really think it is targeted to children, so I maybe wouldn't start with this one. I would maybe even start with the Daughter of the Deep one, because that one is fun. The dialogue is great. We have a lot of different kinds of characters, and they interact together. And it gives you like a taste of what was in the original book, but it updates it for today. But for example, there are parts in here, and when I was rereading, I'm thinking, there is no way a child is going to sit through and read this, because there are like 2 pages where it seems like Verne just kind of almost plagiarized a historical work or a scientific work, and it's talking about math equations, like verbally though. It's not working them out, he's just talking about them. And like nobody talks like that off the top of their head. So that's how he was including some of that scientific information. He just put it in the dialogue, which was kind of silly. But there are many good bridging type of books. It kind of depends on what the person themselves is interested in. I think interest is the #1 thing to get them to make that leap. Yeah.
Is there a gateway Verne you would recommend?
I think just that the one that I mentioned kind of way at the end was, if we can get back over there, Daughter of the Deep would be a good.
But
like
nothing
maybe,
by Verne himself.
It's not. So again, I don't really think I don't really think any of his works are specifically for children, and he did not write them to be children's books.
Sorry, I meant more like 20-year-olds, like
Oh.
21-year-olds. Like I'm 18, but
Oh,
I read
yeah, okay,
more
yeah.
mature. Sorry, I didn't rephrase that well.
Yeah, I
I
was
meant
like,
more
oh,
like we're
9-year-olds,
reading like
yes.
young adult youth novels, but
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
go into the more like truly like mature adult novels.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a classic. I would also say, though, that it may be not good to start with because the dialogue is very dense, and they'll probably get bored of it pretty quickly. But thanks for clarifying that, because I was thinking like young people. Okay, other questions?
I'm sorry. People
Like,
flinch.
no
and I'm
way.
gonna pack them into a question. So, any other
Just stretching.
questions?
Well, if
All
you do
right.
have any more, then you can always email on here, and I'd be happy to have more questions or comments. Or if you want more suggestions about different kind of books in that kind of range and what topics that person likes, just go ahead and let me know.
Okay, thank you, Stacy.
Yeah, you're welcome.